Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Signum Thesis Theater. And I'm delighted that you've been able to join us this evening for what promises to be, as usual, a really interesting session, listening to a student tell us all about the work that they have been doing on their master's thesis. So today we're going to be listening to my student Eugene Sullivan, Gene, who has been working with me for the last few semesters now, putting together a really interesting thesis in which he's exploring a certain set of characters of the Lord of the Rings. I think I can safely say are very rarely discussed in scholarly works, and that is the Woses. So I'm going to hand this over straight away now to Gene. And Gene, first of all, welcome to the Thesis Theatre and congratulations on completing your thesis. Delighted for you. And I'm going to ask you, first of all, the usual starting question. Can you tell everybody a little bit, first of all, about what your thesis is actually about, and then tell us why it is you chose that topic?
Yes. So as you said, I'm focusing on the Woses, or the Drúadan, or the wild men. They have a number of different names. They show up in somewhat unexpectedly in the Return of the King to help the Rohirrim avoid the waiting army to get to Gondor. And I'm going to back up and start over. Off to a good start. All right. So in writing Lord of the Rings, there was a shift in focus from the earlier works that we have, the Book of Lost Tales and the attempts at working out Silmarillion, where the focus of his writing shifted to men more than elves, and became much closer to the day-to-day world that people were living in. He moved from a mythological mode into more of a novelistic mode. And in doing so, he had to fill out the world of men, and there was a lot of cultures that he created in order to populate this world. Now, the Rohirrim, Gondor, the Lossoth up north that we don't really see, but we hear about. The Haradrim that we see coming up from the south. There's a lot of different cultures that were created there. And in creating these cultures, Tolkien drew, to greater or lesser degrees for some of them, on real world cultures for inspiration. The Rohirrim have been written about a lot as Anglo-Saxons on horseback, was the title of one paper I wrote with a question mark, because they are and they aren't. There's Byzantine influence in Gondor. There's Ethiopian influence, potentially, the Sigilwara essay that he wrote for the Haradrim. So for the Woses, what I argue, and I think I show pretty effectively, is that the inspiration for them that he's using is a particular stereotypical representation of sort of collectively Native Americans. And it's a representation that came to him, I think, most directly from the really unfortunately named Piccaninny tribe of Peter Pan. But that, it's the result of a long history, a long chain of different representations by European explorers or tourists or fiction authors of, taking an image of what they think might be happening in North America, and sort of crafting a very very versatile stereotype. And the thing about this Red Indian stereotype, that's how Tolkien refers to them in On Fairy Stories. He loves stories about Red Indians. It's very versatile. It's very flexible. They can be whatever the narrative that they're inserted in really needs them to be. They can be noble. They can be savage. They can be a little bit of both. There's the pigeon language, the pigeon common that the Woses use is very common in Peter Pan, in Fenimore Cooper's Leatherstocking Tales, in the Winnetou books. That could either be taciturn because they don't speak, they're childlike, or they're simply very noble and they speak like it's whatever it needs to be. So he drew on this Red Indian stereotype, this view of Native Americans, and put them in the middle of Gondor. Now they serve a particular purpose in the narrative, which is he needed native guides, and that's a very common trope. They know the land very well, they're very close to the land, so we need guides. But to use that stereotype, it doesn't come without some accompanying baggage might be the wrong word, but it brings things with it. You can't just take a group of people and make them native guides and drop them into this land without dealing with the fact that they have to interact with the cultures around them. So in using the Red Indian trope, it's not just that we get these people here and they can guide them and then we're done with them. Their presence has an impact on the people around them. It changes what Gondor is. It changes what Rohan is. It changes what Numenor was, because Gondor is sort of a successor culture to Numenor. Well, the Woses remember. They have a long oral tradition, apparently, because they remember when the men came up out of the water and started carving up the stone and building the roads. So was that their land first? It recasts Gondor and Numenor as very strongly colonial cultures in the vein of the cultures that came to North America and took over the whole continent. But by the same token, Rohan, the deal that Barrie makes with Theoden is, we will show you the way so you can go help them. The only thing we ask is, please just stop killing us. Which, why are they hunting and killing them? They don't even live in Rohan. It takes both of these cultures. The Anglo-Saxons on horseback, right? Well, they're not just that. They're an invasive culture that has come into what was apparently not actually uninhabited land. There's even Dunharrow, which is a religious site of some sort, clearly built by the Woses because there's statues of them there, and now they've taken that and made it their hold in the mountains. So that's the first part of it. He put them in here, and in doing so, he really changed the nature of the cultures that they interact with, because that's how that stereotype works. It doesn't stand alone. It's very dependent on how it interacts with the cultures around it. Now, having inserted them into the Lord of the Rings, after that was published, a lot of the other writings that we see in Unfinished Tales or in People's Middle-earth is Tolkien attempting to take what he's now created and published and find a way to bring it into alignment with the earlier, his earlier stories, the stories of the First Age and the Second Age. Well, now we have a third age of men. How do we get from the First Age and the awakening of men and the awakening of the children and get to the Third Age? And the problem that I believe he ran into is in bringing these into alignment is that the First Age, as originally conceived, had a very strong hierarchy of peoples. And whether it's a racial hierarchy or another word that might work with it, he used a lot of different words. It is the hierarchy. And there are the light, and there's the twilight, and there's the dark. There's the elves who saw the trees and the elves who didn't. There's when the three kindreds of men are first introduced, we have another threefold hierarchy of the Faramir outlines later, the men of the West and the men of Twilight and the men of Darkness. And what we have with the Woses is wild men, they call them, but they're definitely not men of darkness. They don't fit in any solid way into the hierarchy you'd created. And in attempting sort of shoehorn them back into the First Age, there were a couple different attempts that are a little contradictory. They were sort of a client culture. They lived with the folk of Hollis. But then, how did they become sort of an indigenous people along the west coast of Middle Earth? It's not really clear. And he softened it by saying, well, they're the ancestors of them anyway. They're related in some way. I don't know how it's not the same people. And then in the stories of the Second Age, we have Numenor, stealing the wood of the west coast of Middle Earth in order to build their ships. It's a very common thing that happened in North America too. And whether these people were Woses, whether they were this, whether they were that, is not clear. There's contradictory notes. He couldn't make it work. I think the problem he ran into was, well, he had created this culture, he had to sort of engage with what it means to have them there, and he never really found a good way to fit that into the hierarchy he had originally envisioned for the first and second age. And there's no solid, he never published the Silmarillion. He never reconciled all these things. So we have a lot of different notes in different works that see him attempting to deal with the fact that they're not just a stereotype, they're people, they're humans. What do I do with them? And never really coming to a solid conclusion.
So, I mean, having said all of this, there must have been something that drew you to this topic in the first place. What inspired you to actually do this particular study?
I knew that I wanted to. I knew that I wanted to engage. There's a lot of options in Signum's program, and I knew I wanted to focus specifically on Tolkien, not on one of the other authors. And I was looking for something that hadn't really been explored to any great degree. And what I found, it was actually, my wife was reading The Lord of the Rings, which she finally did. And watching her read it and watching her discover things that weren't in the film, so she was therefore not familiar with. So when she hit the Return of the King and she read the chapter with Rohan going through the forest, she was like, who are these guys?
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, that's a really good question, sweetheart. So she sort of drew my attention to them as something, well, yeah, like they haven't really been explored that much. And in rereading book 5 of Lord of the Rings, I thought about, who are they? What do they do? And I read Verlyn Flieger has a paper, the Tolkien's Wild Men, Medieval and Modern. And she said, they're Hanbari Khan is a stereotypically medieval wild man. Tolkien even calls him a wild man. And I thought, Tolkien doesn't call him a wild man. Elfhelm calls him a wild man. And the sort of the difference, potential difference between the authorial voice and the narrative voice is like, well, what are they? That's how that happened. Is I wanted to explore, well, what are they really? Not just what does Rohan see them as, or what does Gondor see them as, but let's look at them within this world that he's created and see, well, who are they?
Mm-hmm.
So, and they're an indigenous people that are living in the forest, and they're wholly enclosed by a much more militaristic culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that and looking at their characteristics and the way they dressed and the way they speak and everything, it's like, well, he's doing something involving a Native American look. And then I watched Peter Pan because I have kids or something. It's like, okay, I see what's happening here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right, so for the people who are watching, you've now had a little bit of an overview of Eugene's work, and he's also explained some of the reasons why he was drawn to this topic. So now that you've got a little bit more of an understanding of what he's actually talking about, feel free to pop any questions at any time into the question box. And if you see me looking from side to side, by the way, I've got a number of screens, so that's why I'm not turning away from Jean. It's not like that. So I've got the question box right here, and I will be keeping my eye on it. So if you've got questions for Jean, please feel free to pop them into the question box at any point, okay? And Sparrow says, good evening, Eugene.
Hello, Sparrow. Good morning from the West Coast.
Okay, so the next thing I wanted to ask you, you just were talking about how your wife noticed these characters and they stood out to her because they're obviously excised from the movies. And she asked you who they are and you said that's a good question, and then looked into it and realized that there wasn't a lot out there about it and you wanted to choose something that hadn't really been done in Signum before. So did you come across any scholarship that was actually focused on the Woses?
There was some, and well, focused solely on them, no. They show up in work. There was Verlyn Flieger's paper that I mentioned earlier. There's an anthropologist named Virginia Luling that wrote a paper that deals with them and one of the other cultures. It's the Hurons and the Southron. But she takes sort of an anthropological point of view, and she discusses them at some length. And they Dimitri Fimi's Race and Cultural History book, which is fantastic, does also point out, there's a couple pages where they show up where she's discussing that racial hierarchy and how they don't really fit into the kind of the threefold division of men and elves. So there's some. They're not completely ignored. They do show up, but there's not much that focuses sort of solely on them. And one of the reasons is that there's not a whole lot to go on, just in the text itself. There's not a lot of time on the page. They're there for the brief bit of chapter 5 of book 5, and they come back again at the end as Aragorn very helpfully gives them back the land that they've been living on for millennia already. But there's, so anyway, there is some, and I've read, I think, everything I could find where they were brought up. So yeah, they're not completely ignored, but they're not really deeply explored, and people tend to focus on them. They is one of the things that caught my eye was, well, they call them wild men, so let's look at them in the context of medieval wild men, and it's a very it's a fruitful way to look. That's definitely a good context in which to look at them, but it's not the only one. That's looking at them from Rohan's point of view, which is valid, but there's other ways to look at them.
Okay, well, questions are starting to come in about the Woses in particular. So in fact, there's 2 questions here, and they've kind of got a similar track on what they're asking. So Sparrow says, I have not read Tolkien's words about the Woses. Does he particularly say they are modelled on the Red Indians and not lingering Neanderthals? And Joe Hoffman asks, okay, I believe the Woses are, oops, that's just disappeared off my screen. I believe the Woses are a colonized race. What makes them Native Americans in particular? So I think both of them kind of asking there, what makes you identify them as Red Indians, according to the terminology that Tolkien uses, which is of course incredibly outdated, but Native Americans, why would you label them as that?
So his words about them, he doesn't address them very directly in very many places. There is a note that's published in Peoples of Middle-earth where he does discuss them as, and I could look it up, but sort of informally as well, they're a remnant of another people, of a primitive people that, are in this land that they've moved into, which, would sort of speak to them as, yes, they're maybe like that in European terms, they're a remnant of Neanderthal people. There's, wild men living in the woods. And that is a suggestion that he makes. But if you look at what I look at in this is not just their placement in relation to the people around them, but the attributes that they have, the way they dress, the way they speak, and the role that they serve in the text, which is that of pathfinders in the woods. And none of these are on their own are like, nothing is a surefire, like, look, this is the smoking gun that says, none of these on their own are that thing. But the description that he gives of them as being nearly naked and wearing the grass skirt resonates very strongly with not specifically Native American, with a lot of there's 19th century primitive man stereotype that you see in the H. Rider Haggard books, or the other sort of South Sea adventure books. Author I can't remember the name of. There's a strong sort of general savage native vibe with the grass skirt and the being naked. They're nearly naked. The scanty hair pushes you a little more towards that's a common thing that's referenced with not just like I said, Fenimore Cooper or Winnetou or any of the sort of the travelogues that people talk about Native Americans. Is they're often people make a point of the hairlessness. So their physical attributes, could be interpreted as generally savage native types, but also, they do resonate strongly with Native American things. But if you look at the role they play in the text specifically, that sort of wayfinder in the woods with old paths is something that occurs a lot, when it's needed by a text where there are Native Americans in an area and an army needs a guide in the woods. That's something that Chingachgook and Uncas play that role a number of times in Last of the Mohicans. Like if you read in Last of the Mohicans, there's where they're guiding the Major and Cora and them around the French army to get where they need to go. It's very, very similar to the Rohirrim being guided around the waiting orcs to get to Minas Tirith. So it's not just about how they look, it's about what they do, that role that they play. Mm-hmm. And then
so there's a difference, isn't there, between identifying them as Native American and identifying them as the stereotype Red Indian that was created in white literature in this time. Those are two different things, aren't they? You're not saying the Woses are Native American. You're saying that they're actually fulfilling this stereotype of Red Indian.
Yeah, they're fulfilling the Red Indian role, that stereotypical role, and that representation, that stereotype, has a point I make in here. It doesn't have any particular reference to any actually existing Native American culture. It picks little bits and pieces from whoever the writer in question happens to be familiar with, and sort of composites them all into an Indian type that they can use for whatever the narrative needs them to do. And the fictional representations that we see in the 19th and 20th centuries, early 20th centuries, are, I trace some of the way that they pick and choose from the, theoretically non-fictional narratives of the 18th and 17th centuries. But if you look at those, they were written by people who may or may not actually have encountered much in the way of Native Americans in America, and then they were re-edited in Europe for publication to sort of punch them up a little bit and make them sell well. So there's very little reference to any actual tribes that are recognizable. Even in Fenimore Cooper's case, where he names tribes, they're still not actually particularly accurate representations of the actual tribes that he names. So they're not Native American. They're the Woses, and they're in Middle Earth, but they are constructed of elements that are really, really common in the Red Indian stereotype, and the role that they fulfill in the text fits very well in line with that. And then their relationship to the people around them, which is a consequence of the role that they need to fulfill. They need to be there, and they need to have that knowledge to guide them around that. So they must have been there before, so they know these old roles. Like they're fulfilling this stereotypical role very effectively. But they're not.
Yeah, it's a very important distinction to make, isn't it? So, I mean, it's a very important question to be asking. What is Tolkien doing with this particular people? And I think that these are questions that are increasingly being asked, actually, about Tolkien's work in the last, really only the last few years, shamefully enough, but the last few years, we have seen an increase in a scholarly discussion around race in Tolkien. And the idea of race, representation, diversity, etc., has come much more strongly into focus recently. So, where do you see your work kind of fitting into the discussion that's going on right now about Tolkien and race and representation?
I think one of the an aspect that really needs to be taken into account when you talk about not just Tolkien, but I think any author is engaging with race and how race is constructed. Is it's not just about are they using stereotypes, are they invoking stereotypes, but are they interacting with them in any way? Are we uncritically just dropping a stereotypical image on the page and moving on, or is there engagement with it? Is he looking at the stereotype and trying to interrogate it, make sure that there's like, are we looking at the people behind the stereotype, or are we just using it and moving on? Because that sort of that informs how you interpret everything, and whether you can how he treats one group can help us understand how he treats other groups. And I think in this case, if you look at the way they're in the earlier drafts of Return of the King, and you see how they were originally just sort of wild men that fight and run away, and then they're wild men that fight and then and then run away. Like, I think he started by saying, I need this group in this text. And then he, as the writing went on, he looked at how he was using them and the role they were fulfilling. And I think there was engagement with it. And I think that helps to inform, if you want to infer sort of how he felt about different races, how he felt about representation, you look at his engagement with it and see how that works. So hopefully, in this sort of small instance of this one group, if we can look at how he engages with the stereotypes he's using, and if he changes how he's working based on the drafts, which he did, that helps us look at also how he looks at the Southrons or the Haradrim or the Lossoth, which there was a paper at the Tolkien Society seminar a couple months ago about them. It helps us build a sort of a framework for looking at how he looks at all sorts of different groups.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I think it's safe to say there is consensus in academia, well, in certain section of academia, that there are definitely problematic areas on race in Tolkien's work. But the important thing is that readers and scholars are engaging with that and discussing that as part of academic work. And that's why I think what you're doing is really interesting, because you're picking out a particular people that haven't really been focused on, and they are worthy of discussion. And I think, as scholars, it's really important that we are engaging with how an author is being problematic about race and making that part of the way in which we are understanding him. That you think?
Yeah, and that there's the problematicity, if you will, because there's a spectrum of that, sure, and it does, which end of it he falls on, like how problematic one is, does depend on, I think, to some degree at least, whether you're just uncritically using things, or you put the stereotype there and you think about then what that means and how it works, and the classic example shows up in almost every paper that deals with this, I think, is Sam watching the fighting of Faramir's men and the Southrons, and looking at the dying Southron and thinking, like, why are you here? Who told you that you needed to come here? Like, there's very much a sense in Tolkien, the whole book is sort of suffused of compassion. That's his thing, is compassion and pity and mercy and love. That's the crux of the whole thing. And Tolkien takes these stereotypes, and some of them are really, really problematic, but he very often, not always, but very often, makes an effort to put a human behind it. I'm gonna show you the stereotype and then put a person behind it, so you can't just dismiss it as savage Southrons, as wild men in the woods. Like, no, there's people there. It's when you run into the orcs, it gets more difficult, but even then you've got Snaga and Lugdush talking about how we should run off and do our, like, even with the orcs, there's a little bit of personification, but it softens the problematicness, where it's like, no, there's people there, there's humans behind these things.
Okay, so we've got some more questions. Richard White has a question for you. He says, when you look at some of the 16th and 17th century European travelers' accounts, Europeans struggled with what the native peoples they encountered actually were. Were they human? Were they animal? These accounts would eventually be used to justify slavery in the United States. In trying to fit the Woses into the greater history of Middle-earth and into his existing hierarchy, do you think Tolkien struggled with the same issues?
Yeah, I think he did. There was, so in those early travelogues and the explorers, there was, there's a wide variety of reactions. There were people who were perfectly prepared to just do business with Native Americans. Like, you have furs, I want furs. I have steel weapons, and you can have those. And there was a lot of people that were like, all right, you're people. The Roger Williams who founded Rhode Island was very much one of dealing with Native Americans as humans. But there were other people. It was one of the sort of surprising things I ran into actually in studying for this, was that there were a number of people that had a hard time dealing with the idea that there were humans here, because if Adam and Eve happened over here, how did anybody get here? And it was a real problem for a lot of people. And there were suggestions of, well, maybe there was an Adam and Eve on every continent, which is an inventive way of dealing with that. But then there were other people like, well, are they human? Maybe we came from Adam and Eve, and maybe they evolved from apes. There were a lot of people dealing with, like, I don't know how there could be people here, and but this question of origin and stuff is something that Tolkien dealt with too, particularly with relation to the orcs. That was the question of where they came from. Were they corrupted men? Were they corrupted elves? Were they created by? Never resolved. There's never been a solid answer about that, because it's a really difficult question. If they're men or elves that have been corrupted, well, they're children of Iluvatar, and they have souls. Do they go to Mandos when they die? Do they still get the gift of men? Is there redemption for them? He didn't know. He didn't have a solid answer for that. And one of the notes that he made, that's published in there's an essay about the Woses of the Drúadan and Unfinished Tales, suggests, not strongly, but he definitely brings up that maybe there's kinship between the Woses and the orcs back in history, and that the two groups viewed each other as renegades. Is how he says that. So he was thinking, like, maybe they came from wherever they came from. I don't know. And that's raises a really problematic concern, actually, that resonates pretty strongly with the way Native Americans were treated, which is, there's a note in that essay that the Eldar admitted them to the ranks of the Atani, right? So they're granted sort of human status based on their hatred of the orcs and their fighting them. But also, we've just suggested that possibly they're related to one another. And that sort of being granted human status by virtue of the fact that you are prepared to fight on our behalf against the people who you might actually be related to, was very much how different, especially in New England, when the French and the English were fighting one another, very much about how different tribes were granted, like, people status or not. Was like, well, you've allied with us against your cousins over there who also happen to be fighting with the French, so we like you now. And you get to be people, and you can live in our cities. Now, if we don't need you anymore because the fighting is done, we're going to scoot you off that land because we really like to grow things there. But yeah, he definitely struggled with that, like, having put them there. Okay, well, now what are they? Where'd they come from? Who are they? Maybe they share kinship with orcs, and that's problematic in a way. And, there was never a solid resolution for that. That's, contradictory notes published in the history of Middle-earth, and there was never a, yes, they woke up with men wherever the men awoke, or no, they came from somewhere else. He never really resolved it.
Okay, so a question here from Joe Hoffman, and he's asking about a particular resource. He says, did you see the essay Tolkien in Pawnee Land, where a member of the Skiddy Pawnee identifies some of his tribe's traditions in The Lord of the Rings?
I did. I actually, I did, and what was interesting about that was the traditions. So the traditions that he's finding, particularly are focused a lot on things that happen in the Silmarillion. There's Ungoliant, and I'm gonna be vague on the details because I did read it, but it was a year ago now. It was focused on taking traditions from there was a book, the history of the Skidipani, that was in the library at one of the schools that he went to, but it focused more on things that had been taken out and sort of used as inspiration for the Silmarillion specifically. And the thing is that he never did effectively work the Woses back into the Silmarillion stuff very effectively. So I did read it, and it was fascinating. And I think I do mention that he pulls from because he had sort of a lifelong fascination that he said with the Red Indian. He brought it up in On Fairy Stories. There's a reference in one of the published versions of On Fairy Stories about his marked up copy of the Yellow Fairy book. Which actually has a note. There's a couple of stories that are, Andrew Lang just says from the Red Indian, which is not very helpful or descriptive. But there's a note, there's a couple notes Tolkien wrote on them. Like, he definitely had a fascination with Indian culture or Native American culture in general, and he pulled a lot of things, or potentially did. Like Roger Echohawk, who wrote the Tolkien and Pawneeland, is hesitant to strongly assert that he was inspired by these things. He strongly suggests it, but never makes really like a solid definitive statement. So I did read that. It was a fascinating book, but it focused less on things that appeared in Lord of the Rings, more on things that work into the Silmarillion.
Okay, thank you. So keeping with all of this, here with this creation of this particular people that Tolkien himself then had to desperately try to retcon and didn't quite manage it. But there you have them, and they have a function in the narrative, whatever else you say about them. So having these people right there in that moment, how does that help to contribute to that sense of depth of narrative that Tolkien is creating? I mean, as we know, those of us who study Tolkien know how it's, to start quoting Shrek, it's like an onion. It's got many layers. I'm not going to attempt the Shrek voice because no. But you've got this.
I won't either.
You've got this richness, this depth in the narrative. How does this? I mean, the Woses barely appear. They're almost a blink and you miss them. In fact, they're so blink and you miss them that Jackson did completely. So why, what do they contribute to that richness of narrative?
Now, to be fair to Peter Jackson, he had a lot to work through. So I don't think he blinked and missed them. I'm sure he looked at them and thought, no, we're not going to put that in there.
Time, if nothing else.
But there's already a lot of movie. I think one of the things that really helps build the depth that people love so much about Lord of the Rings is the glimpses of historical things that are now, that the landscape is sort of littered with things that are old and partially explained and whatever, and their association, I think, particularly with Dunharrow, is part of it. Like, we have this ancient hold with these statues that Rohan has moved into, and it doesn't know who built it. I don't know, it came from somewhere, but we're using it. And then you see, when they finally meet the Woses, Mary in particular looks at Khanbar Khan and immediately says, well, that's clearly the inspiration for those statues that we saw over there. And it takes this whole, it attaches them, or it identifies them with this ancient enough that Rohan doesn't even know where it came from. Like, there's, they've clearly lived there for thousands of years, but it takes a second for you to put together what's like, that's, I'm not explaining this very well.
It's okay.
but that's it, they're ancient. They're associated with this I don't know. I'm floundering. All right, that's I had a good answer for this one. And
Yeah, I mean,
moving on.
the very fact that they are so clearly an ancient people speaks to the depth of history that we have in this world. Because we already have the Rohirrim, who seem to speak back to the Anglo-Saxon tradition, for example. But the Woses go back way further than that, much, much longer before that. And when you have those, as well as, I mean, we already know the elves are ancient. We know this. But then suddenly you have this human race that are so ancient, they're almost forgotten even by the Rohirrim.
Well, and they have apparently maintained, to some degree at least, a very consistent oral culture over those years. We never see them write. There's no writing at Dunharrow. They don't seem to have any sort of particular material culture aside from the arrows that we hear that they use. But they remember the arrival of the Númenóreans and the roads that they built that are now completely forgotten. Like they've maintained a continuity of culture through invasions by Númenor, incursions by Gondor, by Rohan, through being hunted by the Rohirrim apparently for some reason. And it's something that actually it's a place where Tolkien has sort of happened upon or has intentionally put in one of things that actually resonates fairly strongly with actual Native American cultures, which is that continuity of culture. There's a book I read that's by Daniel Heath Justice, which is Why Indigenous Literatures Matter. And that's one of the things he brings up, like that culture, that continuity, that is how the people remain the people, right? Is telling those stories and maintaining them. And it's one reason why, in America and Canada with residential schools and stuff, people try to clamp down on that and knock that culture out, because now it's much easier to control them if we can crush that culture, right? The Woses have maintained that, and they have, they've offered it in the service of defeating Sauron, despite the fact that they're offering it to people with who they do not apparently have a very friendly relationship. But yeah, that's it's not just that they're old, it's that they're old and part of a long chain of culture.
Okay, so moving slightly on, having completed this body of work that you've now done, most of the students that I supervise, they get to this point and they're like, but there were so many other things I wanted to say and I couldn't because of the word limit and all that kind of thing. So were there some things that you would have liked to have either put in or kept in but couldn't, that you would really like to have had something to say in your thesis?
Well, there was one avenue I really tried to pursue that I think if I spoke more languages I would have been able to pull off, which is the linguistic aspect, which is very, very important in Middle Earth. It's very important to Tolkien, and for many other cultures he expends a lot of ink talking about their languages. With the Woses, there's almost nothing. I think we get 3 words and 1 name, and we're only told what one of those words actually means. The Han Barrie Han, he glosses that is Han, son of Han. So we got 1. Barrie means son of. They call the orcs Gorgun, but we don't actually know what that means. That's just their word for them. Now that sounds a bit like it might have been inspired by Gorgon, Greek word, which sort of generally means monster. So and then we get Drúch becomes their name for themselves. And he doesn't do that until much later. That's years later when he's writing the essay that's published in Unfinished Tales. And that's I love when Tolkien does this. I had another paper about it a couple of years back where he takes a word, like I need this to mean something, but it already means something in a different language. So he just changes it. But then there's sort of a ripple effect where it's like, okay, I changed it here, which means that the etymology of this that I use, well, that's wrong now. So, Drúadan, Drú meant wood, and Adon meant man. It meant woodmen. They lived in the woods. They were woodmen. So he had to take Drew and say, well, no, that's from their name for themselves, which is Drua. Okay, but now Drúadan Forest means something else, and Drúwaith Iar, which is, there was sort of a ripple effect out there. But we get nothing with words. I really would love to figure out if he had any particular, if there's some way to bring the few words we get together and say, okay, well, he was working with Greek because Gorgon, or maybe it's Russian because Druj and Drug are similar. I don't know, but I tried, and if I spoke more languages, maybe I would have had the moment where I'm like, it didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like there's probably still something to be done there, but there's not a whole lot to work with. And that's really the one that sticks with me. I wish there was a way to dig more into the language. It's so important to every other culture, and he just didn't do much with it. I'm always sort of hoping in, like The Nature of Middle Earth, or maybe, some new issue of Parma that comes out, there's going to be like, we found more words. And then it will, sort of unlock that word hoard. We can do something with it, but it hasn't yet.
Great. So aside from that, given that you've now completed this thesis, if you were going to carry on working in this area, aside from the language, is there any other place in which you could expand on the knowledge you've already put into the thesis?
So one of the things that Amy Sturgis, who's I think here, is my second reader, suggested, which was you really should engage more with actual Native American voices, with scholars who, are on the other side of this stereotype that I'm dealing with. Like I'm clearly on one side, they're on the other side of that. And I did read some, and I did, like I said, I found that there's, he happened upon a very interesting thing, which is that continuity of culture. But I really feel like it could definitely be expanded by looking at more, by bringing in more actual Native American voices, and looking at, sort of how that stereotype was constructed, from the other side of it. And sort of there are some, sources from the 17th and 18th centuries from the Native American side. They exist. They're a little harder to come by because they were not published in great numbers in Europe, because no one's really interested in them. So I would like to explore that more, and look at sort of how that is, how it's understood by the people whose ancestors were actually the source for the stereotype, and who now are still living with the outcomes of sort of being grouped like this, and being represented like this, and having it used as an excuse to put you on reservations, to put you in schools and stuff like that. Like, Tolkien was sort of looking at, okay, let's put a human face behind this thing. Those human faces still exist, and they're still here. There's plenty of them around, and I did engage a little bit, but I really think there's more that could be done there. But it opens up new avenues. That's a whole other 40 pages worth of stuff. There is a limit to how much one can do, and so.
Yes, that is true. I mean, obviously, one day, if you wanted to create a publishable paper out of it, then perhaps to gain the balance in that publishable paper, you could engage with it then. But yes, if one day you decided to expand, I think that would be a really important area to create that balance of argument in the thesis. But you're right, it happens with everybody who does their master's thesis. They're like, I want to do all the things, but I've only got 10 to 15,000 words in which to do all the things, and it's
that's the slippery slope to a doctoral dissertation, right?
As we have discussed, yes, it is indeed.
Like, what I could do is I could do another one.
Well, yes, absolutely. Yeah, if you want 2 master's degrees, I'm not going to tell you no, that's for sure. And Amy Sturgis.
My wife has been very. My wife has. Oh, sorry. I said my wife has been very patient through this whole process. But I'm not going to embark on anything else like this right now, because that's not going to go over well.
Yeah, that's fair enough. I know all about the spouse being very, very patient while you work through a whole load of stuff. I completely understand. Amy does say hello and thanks for the shout out. It's lovely to have Amy Sturgis here with us. And Amy, of course, was Jean's second reader for the thesis. I'm very grateful to her for the input into your thesis. Okay. Amy says, congratulations to you. Richard has a question, says, did you just liken Native American reservations to how the Woses were granted the land they were already on?
Yeah, so at the end of Return of the King, in recognition for their help, right? Aragorn, as he's taking his entourage back through the wood, makes an announcement to the listening ears in the woods, I give them this land to, let no man trespass on it without their permission, which is interesting because, it's already theirs. They've been there since before Gondor showed up, before, Numenor arrived. They presumably had even more land because Dunharrow was theirs, but now it's in Rohan. So it's an interesting, it's something that I discuss in the paper, which is Aragorn giving it to them because it's a part of Gondor, or is he recognizing their existing sovereignty? And it's hard to tell. I think there's a degree to which he's recognizing the existing sovereignty. There's an initial version of that passage where he actually speaks to Hanbar Khan and some of his headmen face to face, and they bow and they put their foreheads on his feet, and it's much more paternalistic for Aragorn, where he's really the king who's, and he softened that and changed it to no, he just announces it to them in the woods. They roll their drums, which is a very ambiguous response, which is that thank you? Is that, yeah, we know? It could be taken in a number of different ways. So, but it's, that sort of granting back to people the land that they've already been on for a very long time is something that happened a lot in North America and in America and Canada. And, sometimes you would say, well, you had this much land. We're going to give you this part in the middle of it because we don't actually want that. But later governors or later presidents or later monarchs, like, well, now we actually do kind of want that land. So now we're going to scooch you off. So you have to wonder, is a future king of Gondor going to decide that actually they'd really like that forest to, have a city at the base of the Island Beacon or something, and now we're going to scoot you off that. It resonates very strongly with that sort of, where it's like, we're going to recognize your ownership of this land that you've actually been on since before we got here. And you hope that Aragorn is simply recognizing the existing sovereignty. It's not really easy to say or easy to determine. And yeah, you don't really know what's going to happen in the fourth age.
Okay, so just to kind of nod back to what Amy Sturgis said just now, she said congratulations, and I'd like to echo that. Congratulations on completing this piece of work. It's a long process, it's a tough process, and it's a challenging process as well. This is a question that I usually ask my students when they get to this point, which is, what advice would you give other master's degree students who haven't quite got as far as the thesis stage? What advice would you give them to help to prepare them for the process that you've just come through?
Well, I think everyone is still required to take the research methods class, right?
No.
Are we not anymore?
We're doing there will be a new type of class that will help to do that. But the research methods class has gone by the by for now.
No, well, never mind about that then. I think the two things that really helped me that I had to sort of, that I hadn't been doing with the earlier papers I'd written is one of them was simply keeping my research organized in a way that was easy to actually look through it. Now I used an app called Scrivener, which I know is designed for general, writing, whether it's papers or novels or whatever you want to do. But it made it really easy to keep everything. It's a nice sidebar where I got all my sections and I had an outline, and each section was its own document. So I wasn't looking at a 40-page document the whole time, which is very difficult for me to deal with, like so many blank pages, you know. But keeping it all really organized made it very easy for me to go back and forth between different things when I was trying to reference stuff, which is really helpful. Earlier papers was all sort of a collection of Google documents or whatever, and I would get lost and I wasn't sure what I was looking for. But the other thing is that editing is easier than writing. You know, it's much easier to fix something you've already written than it is to sort of look at the blank page and put the words down. So my first draft was very short and very rough, and I thought it doesn't matter what this draft looks like. Nobody's going to see it because I'm going to fix it. Just do something. And having done something, it was much easier to go back and say, okay, now let's look at this paragraph. Let's make it into something better. So that's the real thing. Editing's easier than writing, so don't try to make it perfect on that first draft. Just put something on the paper and then go back and fix it. Mm-hmm. And if in fixing it you decide you have to throw out that whole thing, well, that's what happens sometimes. You know, there were paragraphs that just disappeared because I'm like, that's actually not useful.
No, I have to agree with you with that last point, because there's something kind of terrifying about the tyranny of the blank page. It feels so much better if you've got stuff written, even if that stuff isn't exactly as you want it. And you're absolutely right. Reaching for perfection on your first draft is just far too much pressure. Just get your ideas down and fix them later. Completely agree with that.
Like even if by the end it's not even complete sentences anymore, and it's just this point, that point, that point, that's enough. That's something, and then you can fix it.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, just throwing down a bunch of bullet points is good, because you can always come back and expand the bullet points. That is absolutely correct.
Yeah,
okay.
I realized halfway through my Signum journey just exactly how effective outlining really is, and I wish I had done that more often when I was an undergrad. I didn't see the value in it yet, but now I do. Outlining is a great idea.
Yes, if you can build the scaffold, you can put the building around it.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. So Professor Swank says, bravo, Gene. Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Yeah. And Sparrow says, thank you, Eugene, as well. And thank you. Yes, thank you so much for dragging me along on your Signum journey.
Well, thank you for coming with me.
It was great fun for me, and it was wonderful to see those first, oh my goodness, bullet points actually be crafted into a completed thesis. That was a pleasure and a privilege. So thank you very much for allowing me to work with Eugene. It's been great.
It was my pleasure. Thank you. I would not, I think, have actually managed to successfully make it through this whole thing without, you and Sparrow and Chris and just everybody. So many people at Signum that are all very, everyone is so, it was very, very supportive and enthusiastic in this community. And it really is very, very helpful. It makes the whole thing sort of much more, it's not just, it's stressful sometimes. There's a lot of learning, it's whatever, but it's also very pleasant and pleasant is the word, but it's very, it feels like a community. Everyone is we all want to see each other succeed. That's nice.
We all want to see each other succeed. I think that's the perfect moment to end, because that is absolutely true. We all want to see each other succeed and succeed.
That's Signum's new slogan.
Wonderful. So hearty congratulations. I'm sure there's applause going on throughout the audience. Amy saying yes indeed, and yeah, I'm delighted for you. So thank you very much to everybody who has joined us today for Gene's Thesis Theatre. I'm really grateful that you came along. Thank you to those people who've asked questions and engaged with it. Thank you also to those who just were here and have listened and enjoyed along with the rest of us. And that's it. So thank you again, and we'll hope to see you another time for another Thesis Theatre. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.